Freeze! Officer Tom Bennett shouted, his voice echoing down the cold, dimly lit alley. His flashlight caught the figure of a disheveled man rummaging through a dumpster. The man flinched, raising his hands in surrender as a half-eaten sandwich fell to the ground. "Please, I didn't do anything," the man pleaded, his voice shaky but calm. His coat was tattered, and his shoes had holes so large his toes peeked through. He looked like every other homeless man Tom had seen during his beat in downtown Chicago. Tom cautiously approached, his hand hovering over his holstered taser. "What are you doing back here?" "This is private property," he barked. "I was just hungry," the man stammered, his pale blue eyes wide with fear. He pointed to the discarded sandwich. Tom's gaze softened for a brief moment, but protocol was protocol. "Turn around, hands behind your back. You're under arrest for trespassing." The man didn't resist. As Tom cuffed him, his radio crackled, reporting a nearby burglary. He tightened the cuffs and marched the man toward his cruiser. The man looked back at him and said softly, "I don't belong here." "You'll see." Something about the man's tone sent a shiver down Tom's spine. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. As the car pulled away, Tom glanced in the rearview mirror. The man stared out the window, calm, composed, and oddly dignified for someone in his position. Tom tried to shake the feeling, but his mind kept circling back to the man's strange confidence. 3 weeks earlier, Tom's mornings usually started the same. A quick coffee from Joe's Diner and a patrol of the usual hotspots for trouble. His beat wasn't glamorous, an area where the wealthy brushed shoulders with the desperate. Skyscrapers gleamed on one side of the street, while tents and cardboard shelters dotted the other. Joe, the diner's owner, greeted Tom with his usual warmth. "Morning, Officer Bennett." "Usual?" "You bet," Tom said, sliding onto a stool. "How's it looking out there today?" Joe shrugged. "Same old. Kids with their phones, tourists gawking, and those poor souls out there." He nodded toward the window where a cluster of homeless people huddled around a makeshift fire. Tom sighed. He'd seen it all, good people caught in bad luck, but also scammers playing the system. It was hard to tell who was who anymore. As he sipped his coffee, a young woman burst through the door. She was breathless, clutching her purse. "Officer, someone's following me." Tom immediately rose, his hand resting on his holster. "Stay here," he ordered, stepping outside. The street was busy, and Tom scanned the crowd. He spotted a man lurking near the corner, his face obscured by a hood. Tom called out, and the man bolted. "Stop!" Tom shouted, chasing him down the block. The man darted through alleys, knocking over trash cans to slow Tom down. Just as Tom closed the distance, the man slipped into a crowded subway station. Tom's heart pounded as he scanned the crowd. He caught a glimpse of the hooded man boarding a train just as the doors closed. Frustrated, Tom slammed his hand on the nearest wall. Returning to the diner, Tom reassured the woman that the man was gone, though unease lingered in his gut. Whoever that guy was, he wasn't your average purse snatcher. The rest of the day dragged, but the unsettling morning stayed with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing in his usually predictable routine. That evening, Tom parked his cruiser near a park where the homeless often gathered. He liked to keep an eye on the area, offering help when he could and moving along those causing trouble. As he approached the group, he noticed a new face. A man sitting alone on a bench, staring at the horizon. His clothes were worn but clean, and he seemed oddly out of place among the others. Tom approached, his usual stern demeanor softening. "Hey there, you new around here?" The man looked up and smiled faintly. "Just passing through. Got a name?" "James," the man replied, his voice even and calm. Tom studied him. Something about James felt different. He wasn't like the others. But before Tom could ask more, his radio crackled with a report of a robbery in progress. "Stay out of trouble," Tom warned, heading back to his cruiser. Back to the present. As the cruiser pulled into the station, James still hadn't said much. Tom processed him quickly, but as he handed over the paperwork, the desk sergeant raised an eyebrow. "Tom, you sure about this one? He doesn't have the usual vibe." Tom hesitated, then nodded. caught him trespassing. He was digging through a dumpster on private property. The sergeant shrugged and led James to the holding cell. As Tom watched him walk away, he noticed how James carried himself, head high, steps measured. That night, as Tom filled out his report, his curiosity got the better of him. He ran James's name through the system, half expecting nothing to come up. What he found made his blood run cold. James wasn't just anyone. He wasn't even supposed to be here. Tom stared at the screen, his hands trembling. What he had just discovered would change everything. Tom stared at the screen, his heart racing. He double-checked the name, the description, and the database results, hoping he had made some kind of mistake. But there it was, in plain text: James Hunter, CEO and founder of Hunter Innovations, a tech company valued at over $1 billion. It didn't make sense. How could the man he'd just arrested, a homeless man in tattered clothes, digging through a dumpster, be the same person who appeared in Forbes' top 10 young billionaires to watch? Tom leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Maybe this was some kind of bizarre coincidence. Maybe James Hunter was a common name. But the description matched, right down to the pale blue eyes. And when he searched for images, there it was, a photo of a clean-shaven, confident man in a tailored suit. The resemblance was uncanny. Tom's first instinct was to march back to the holding cell and confront James. But something stopped him. If this man truly was James Hunter, then why was he living like this? Why hadn't he said anything? His thoughts were interrupted by the desk sergeant. "Bennett, you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Yeah," Tom lied, minimizing the screen. "Just tired. Long shift." The sergeant gave him a skeptical look, but didn't press further. Tom packed up his things and decided to head home early, his mind racing with questions. The next morning, Tom couldn't shake the mystery surrounding James. He arrived at the station early, determined to get answers. As he passed the holding cells, he saw James sitting on the bench, his back straight and his eyes closed as if he were meditating. "James," Tom called out, his voice firm. James opened his eyes slowly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Officer Bennett," he replied, his tone polite but guarded. Tom glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot. "I ran your name through the system last night. Care to explain why it says you own $1 billion company?" James didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a small, almost amused smile. "I told you, officer. I don't belong here." "That's not an answer," Tom snapped, lowering his voice. "If you're really James Hunter, what are you doing living on the streets? Why didn't you say anything when I arrested you?" James leaned back against the wall, his expression unreadable. "Would you have believed me if I had told you?" Tom hesitated, knowing the answer was no. "I'll tell you my story," James said finally. "But only if you're willing to listen without judgment." Tom crossed his arms, torn between frustration and curiosity. "I'm listening." James began to speak, his voice steady but tinged with an undercurrent of emotion. A year ago, James had been at the top of his game. Hunter Innovations was the darling of the tech world, known for its groundbreaking AI technology. But success had come at a cost. James described the sleepless nights, the constant pressure to outperform competitors, and the growing disconnect from the people around him. "I was surrounded by people," James said, "but I was lonelier than I'd ever been. Everyone wanted something from me: money, favors, partnerships. I didn't know who to trust anymore." One night, after a particularly grueling day, James decided to take a walk to clear his head. He wandered into a part of the city he rarely visited, a neighborhood filled with shelters, soup kitchens, and makeshift tents. For the first time, he saw a side of life he'd been blind to. "I met a man named Leroy," James continued. "He was homeless, but he had a wisdom about him that I couldn't ignore. He told me something that stuck with me. You can have all the money in the world, but if you've lost yourself, you've got nothing." James paused, his gaze distant. I realized I didn't even know who I was anymore. So, I made a decision. I walked away. I left everything behind: the company, the money, the lifestyle. I wanted to start over, to find out what really mattered. Tom stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. "You just gave it all up?" "That's insane." "Maybe," James admitted. "But for the first time in years, I felt free. I've been living on the streets ever since, learning from people like Leroy, trying to understand what it means to live a meaningful life. Tom didn't know what to say. On one hand, James's story sounded like the ramblings of a man who'd lost his grip on reality. On the other hand, there was something profoundly honest about it. Before Tom could respond, the sergeant called out from the front desk. "Bennett, we've got a situation. Armed robbery at the corner store on 7th. Suspect still on the scene." Tom cursed under his breath. "Stay here," he told James, though he knew there was no chance of him going anywhere in handcuffs. As Tom rushed out to his cruiser, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much bigger story. The robbery scene was chaos. Shattered glass littered the ground, and a small crowd had gathered outside the store. Tom drew his weapon as he approached the entrance, his pulse quickening. Inside, a masked man was shouting at the cashier, waving a gun in the air. "Empty the register. Now." Tom raised his weapon. "Police. Drop the gun." The suspect whirled around, his finger twitching on the trigger. Time seemed to slow as Tom assessed the situation. The suspect was young, maybe 19 or 20, and visibly shaking. "Don't do this," Tom said, his voice steady. "It's not worth it." The suspect hesitated, glancing between Tom and the cashier. Suddenly, the cashier made a move for something under the counter. The suspect panicked, pulling the trigger. The deafening sound of the gunshot filled the store. Back at the station, James sat in his cell, unaware of the chaos unfolding just blocks away. He stared at the ceiling, deep in thought. Tom's questions had stirred memories James had tried to bury, memories of boardrooms, headlines, and the relentless chase for more. He had walked away from that life, but now he wondered if the past would ever truly let him go. As the station doors burst open and officers rushed in with updates from the scene, James couldn't help but feel that the world he'd tried so hard to escape was closing in on him once again. And this time, there would be no running away. Tom crouched behind a display rack, his heart pounding as the suspect's gunshot echoed through the store. He peeked around the corner, his mind racing. The cashier was on the ground, clutching their arm. Blood seeped through their fingers, but they were alive. The suspect was frozen, his gun still raised, trembling as his panicked breaths filled the silence. "Listen to me," Tom shouted, keeping his weapon trained on the young man. "It doesn't have to end like this. Put the gun down. Nobody else needs to get hurt." The suspect's eyes darted around the room, desperate for an escape. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to shoot anyone," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Then prove it," Tom said firmly. "Put the gun down, and let's talk. I can help you, but you've got to trust me." The suspect hesitated, his grip on the weapon loosening slightly. For a moment, it seemed like he might comply. But then, the sound of sirens in the distance made him snap. "No, they'll lock me up forever," he yelled, turning toward the store's back door. Tom moved quickly, intercepting the suspect before he could flee. A struggle ensued, the two of them grappling for control of the gun. The suspect was stronger than he looked, and Tom felt his grip slipping. A shot rang out. The suspect collapsed, clutching his leg. Tom had managed to fire a non-lethal shot in the scuffle. The young man screamed in pain as the gun slid across the floor. Tom kicked it away and called for backup, his hands trembling as adrenaline coursed through him. The other officers arrived moments later, securing the scene and attending to the wounded. Tom stayed long enough to ensure the cashier was stable and the suspect was taken into custody. Then, he drove back to the station, his mind still reeling. When Tom walked into the precinct, he was greeted with a mix of cheers and questions. "Nice work out there, Bennett," one officer said, clapping him on the shoulder. Another asked, "You all right?" That looked intense. "I'm fine," Tom replied, though he didn't feel fine. He grabbed a cup of coffee and headed to his desk, where he found himself staring at James's name on his computer screen again. His thoughts were interrupted by the desk sergeant. "Bennett, you've got someone asking to speak with you. Says it's urgent." Tom frowned. "Who is it?" The sergeant shrugged. "Some lawyer. Fancy suit, expensive briefcase. Says he's here about your homeless guy." Tom's stomach tightened. He walked into the waiting area, where a tall man in a tailored suit was standing. The man extended a hand. "Officer Bennett, I'm Richard Avery. I represent James Hunter." Tom shook his hand cautiously. "You're his lawyer?" "Not exactly," Richard replied. "I'm his business associate. Or at least I was." Tom raised an eyebrow. "So, you're confirming he's the James Hunter? As in, Hunter Innovations?" Richard nodded. "Yes, and I'm here to ensure his release. You're holding the CEO of one of the most valuable tech companies in the world in a jail cell." Tom was at a loss for words. Why didn't he say anything? Why is he even living like this? Richard hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "James has his reasons, but that's not for me to explain. All I need is your assurance that he'll be treated fairly while I handle the paperwork for his release." Tom leaned back, folding his arms. Fair treatment isn't the issue here. He was trespassing. And frankly, I don't understand why a billionaire is out digging through dumpsters. Richard sighed. James is unique. He's always believed in finding meaning outside of wealth. But his decisions, as unconventional as they may seem, are his own. My job is to protect his interests, even when he makes it difficult. Tom glanced toward the holding cells. James was sitting in the same spot, looking as calm and collected as ever. "You've got your work cut out for you," Tom muttered. Richard's visit left Tom with more questions than answers. He decided to confront James directly. Walking into the holding area, he pulled up a chair and sat across from the man who had quickly become the biggest enigma of his career. "Your lawyer, or whatever he is, just confirmed who you are," Tom said, watching James's reaction closely. James smiled faintly. "I figured he'd show up eventually." "So, you've been living on the streets by choice?" Tom pressed. "Why? You could have just said who you were when I arrested you. And what would that have accomplished?" James countered. "You would have let me go because of my name, not because of who I am. That's not the kind of life I want." Tom shook his head in disbelief. "You're telling me you'd rather dig through trash and sleep on benches than live in a penthouse?" James leaned forward, his expression serious. "Have you ever felt like you were drowning, Officer Bennett? Not in water, but in expectations, responsibilities, and noise. That's what my life was like. Walking away wasn't about giving up. It was about breathing again." Tom didn't know how to respond. For years, he'd worked with people who'd lost everything against their will. And here was a man who had willingly thrown it all away. It was baffling, yet oddly compelling. Before Tom could ask more, an officer called out from the front desk. "Bennett, we've got a problem." Tom and James both looked up. "What now?" Tom muttered, heading to the desk. The officer handed him a file. "It's about the robbery suspect from earlier. Turns out he's tied to a string of similar crimes across the city. We think he's part of a larger operation." Tom's mind raced. A larger operation meant more danger, more chaos, and likely more victims. He glanced back at James, who was watching him with a curious expression. "Looks like your quiet life just got a lot more interesting," James said, a hint of amusement in his voice. Tom sighed, knowing James was right. And deep down, he had a feeling their paths were far from finished crossing. Tom slammed the file shut, his mind swimming with the new revelation about the robbery suspect. A larger operation meant more than just catching one desperate kid. It meant unraveling an entire network. The kind of network that would take weeks, maybe months, to bring down. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was going to get messy, but he couldn't focus on that just yet. He glanced back toward the holding cell where James sat, still unervingly calm. Tom knew he couldn't ignore the billionaire's bizarre situation for long. "Officer Bennett, you're gonna want to see this," the sergeant called out, pulling Tom from his thoughts. "What now?" Tom asked, heading to the desk. The sergeant handed him another document. "It's about Hunter Innovations. Their board of directors has been trying to contact James for months. Looks like the company's been in free fall since he disappeared." Tom's eyes widened as he scanned the paper. Stocks plummeting, investors pulling out, employees jumping ship. The once thriving tech giant was crumbling without its leader. "Does James know about this?" Tom asked. The sergeant shrugged. "If he does, he doesn't seem to care. But the board's desperate. They're offering a reward for any information leading to his return." Tom glanced at the holding cells, a new wave of frustration bubbling up. How could someone willingly abandon a company that so many people depended on? Did James even realize the chaos his absence had caused? Or worse, did he just not care? Tom made his way back to the cell, determined to get answers. James looked up as he approached, his expression unreadable. "Your company is falling apart," Tom said bluntly, holding up the report. "Did you know that?" James's calm demeanor didn't falter. "I expected as much." "You expected it?" Tom snapped. "Do you have any idea how many people are losing their jobs because of you? How many families are being affected?" James sighed, leaning back against the wall. "Hunter Innovations isn't just a company. It's a machine. And like any machine, it needs maintenance to keep running. I walked away because I realized I'd become the fuel. The more I gave, the more it consumed me. It wasn't sustainable." Tom stared at him, trying to process the logic, or lack thereof. "So, what? You decided to let the whole thing burn just to save yourself?" James shook his head. "I didn't want it to burn. I wanted it to adapt, to survive without me. If it can't, then maybe it wasn't as strong as I thought." Tom clenched his fists. "That's a nice sentiment, but it doesn't change the fact that real people are suffering because of your choices. You have a responsibility to them, whether you like it or not." For the first time, James's composure cracked. He leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "And what about my responsibility to myself, Officer Bennett? What about my right to live a life that doesn't destroy me?" The two men locked eyes, the tension thick in the air. Before Tom could respond, the sergeant called out again. "Bennett, another robbery just came in. This one's bigger. Multiple suspects, armed and dangerous." Tom's jaw tightened. He turned to James. "We're not done here," he said before heading out the door. The scene of the new robbery was chaos. A high-end jewelry store had been hit, and this time, the suspects weren't amateurs. They'd moved with precision, disabling the security cameras and taking hostages. By the time Tom arrived, SWAT was already on site. "What's the situation?" Tom asked the commanding officer. "For suspects inside, heavily armed," the officer replied. "They've got 6 hostages, and they're demanding a car and safe passage out of the city. We've got negotiators on the line, but they're not budging." Tom surveyed the scene, his heart pounding. This wasn't like the convenience store robbery earlier. These suspects knew exactly what they were doing, and the stakes were higher than ever. As he watched the scene unfold, Tom couldn't help but think about James. The man had walked away from a world of wealth and power, yet here Tom was, risking his life to protect people caught in the crossfire of greed. The negotiator's voice crackled over the radio. "They're giving us 10 minutes to meet their demands, or they start shooting." Tom's blood ran cold. He knew they couldn't give in, but he also knew that time was running out. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number. The text read, "I can help. Let me talk to them." Tom frowned, his mind racing. Was this a prank? A mistake? Or was it James? The thought sent a chill down his spine. He didn't have time to think. The clock was ticking, and lives were on the line. Taking a deep breath, he made a decision that would change everything. He dialed the number. The voice on the other end was calm and confident. "Officer Bennett, I assume?" "James?" Tom asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Yes," James replied. "And if you want to save those hostages, you're going to have to trust me." Tom felt his grip on the phone tighten. "What are you talking about? How could you possibly help with this?" "Just patch me through to the negotiator," James said. "I know how these people think. I've dealt with enough high-stakes situations to know what works and what doesn't. You don't have time to second-guess me, officer. Do you trust me or not?" Tom hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If he was wrong, the consequences could be catastrophic. But something in James's voice, a quiet, unwavering certainty, made him take the gamble. "Fine," Tom said, his voice steady. "But if this goes sideways, it's on you." As he handed the phone to the negotiator, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he had just opened the door to a chain of events that would be impossible to stop. Tom stood by, his nerves on edge, as James's voice came through the negotiator's radio. The hostages' lives now depended on a man who, just days ago, had been digging through a dumpster. Tom struggled to reconcile the calm, commanding tone James now used with the homeless man he had arrested. "This is James Hunter," James began, his voice smooth and confident. "I know you don't know me, but I understand what you're feeling. You're in a corner, and you think there's no way out. But there's always a way out that doesn't end in bloodshed." The lead suspect's voice came through, crackling with tension. "You don't know anything about us. We don't have time for games. We'll do what we have to." "I do know about you," James replied, unshaken. "I know this isn't the life you imagined for yourself. I know you're scared. And I know you're smart enough to realize this doesn't have to end the way you think it will." Tom exchanged a glance with the negotiator, who seemed skeptical but continued patching James through. The officers surrounding the perimeter watched anxiously, their weapons trained on the store. "Why should I believe you?" the suspect challenged. "Because I've been where you are," James said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced everyone listening. "Not with a gun in my hand, but backed into a corner, feeling like I had no choice but to fight my way out. But trust me when I tell you, the choice you make right now will follow you for the rest of your life." The line went quiet for a moment. Tom's heart pounded as he imagined the suspects inside, weighing their options. James continued, his tone softening. "You don't need to trust me completely, just enough to take the first step. Release one hostage. Show me you're willing to talk, and I'll show you we can work this out together." The negotiator glanced at Tom, silently asking if he should cut the line. Tom shook his head. Something about James's approach felt right. And then, the lead suspect's voice broke through the static. "All right," he said reluctantly. "One hostage. But no tricks." A collective sigh of relief swept through the officers as one of the hostages, a middle-aged woman with tear-streaked cheeks, was released. She stumbled out of the store, sobbing as paramedics rushed to her side. Tom grabbed the radio. "Good work, James. Keep going." Inside the station, James remained calm, leaning against the wall of his holding cell. He closed his eyes, focusing on the sound of the suspects' voices. He'd spent years negotiating billion-dollar deals, navigating egos and power struggles. This wasn't so different, except the stakes were life and death. "What's next?" Tom's voice came through the line. James opened his eyes. "I'll get them to release another hostage, but you need to be ready. They're going to start making demands." Tom relayed the plan to the negotiator, who nodded and passed it along to the SWAT team. Every second felt like an eternity as James worked to keep the suspects calm. "You've done the right thing by releasing one hostage," James said. "Now let's keep going. Let another one go, and we'll talk about what you need to get out of this safely." The lead suspect hesitated, clearly torn. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you can talk us down like we're some stupid kids?" "I think you're smarter than you're giving yourself credit for," James countered. "And I think you know that every hostage you release is a step closer to walking out of this alive." Another long pause. Then, the voice crackled through again. "Fine. One more." The door to the store opened, and a young man stumbled out, visibly shaken. The SWAT team pulled him to safety, and the crowd watching from behind barricades erupted in cheers. Back at the station, the sergeant approached Tom. "I don't know how he's doing it, but it's working." Tom nodded, though unease gnawed at him. James's ability to de-escalate the situation was impressive, but it also raised more questions. How had a man who claimed to have left everything behind retained such sharp negotiation skills? And why was he willing to help in the first place? "Bennett," the sergeant added, lowering his voice. "You sure we can trust this guy? What if he's playing us?" Tom frowned. "I don't think he is. He has nothing to gain from this. If anything, he's proving he's more than what he seems. Or proving he's got his own agenda," the sergeant muttered before walking away. Tom returned his focus to the radio. "James, the hostages are safe. Now what?" James's voice came through, calm and steady. "Now we buy time. They're not going to give up easily, but they're starting to doubt themselves. That's when we make our move." Inside the jewelry store, the suspects were unraveling. The lead suspect paced back and forth, his hands shaking as he gripped his weapon. "What's the plan, Derek?" one of the others asked, fear evident in his voice. "We stick to the plan," Derek snapped. "We get the car, and we get out of here." "Man, this is going sideways," another muttered. "That guy on the radio is messing with our heads." Derek glared at him. "He doesn't know us. He doesn't know what we've been through." But the doubt was spreading, and Derek could feel it. He grabbed the radio. "All right, Hunter, you've got our attention. What's next?" James's reply was immediate. "Next, you prove you're serious about working with me. Release the rest of the hostages, and I'll make sure you get out of this alive." Tom's eyes widened. "James, that's a big gamble. You think they'll go for it?" "They're scared," James replied. "Scared people want reassurance. And right now, I'm their best chance at finding it." The radio went silent as Derek and his crew deliberated. Tom's pulse raced as he waited for the suspect's response. Then, the door to the store creaked open again. But this time, no hostages came out. Instead, a single gunman emerged, his weapon raised. "Get back!" he shouted, scanning the crowd. Tom's hand flew to his weapon as the situation escalated. He knew one wrong move could turn everything James had worked for into chaos. The suspect barked into the radio. "You said you'd help us, Hunter. Prove it, or people start dying." James's calm voice came through. "I will, but you have to trust me. Lower your weapon, and we'll take this step by step." The suspect hesitated, his finger twitching on the trigger. Tom held his breath, praying that James's words would reach him. But before the man could make a decision, a loud bang shattered the air. Tom's heart sank. Everything was unraveling, and he had no idea if James could pull them back from the brink. The gunshot reverberated through the air, and Tom instinctively ducked, his weapon drawn. Officers around him took defensive positions, shouting warnings to the suspect. Chaos erupted as the crowd of onlookers screamed and scrambled for cover. Tom's heart pounded as he scanned the scene, trying to locate the source of the gunshot. To his relief, no one appeared injured. The suspect outside the jewelry store looked as startled as anyone, his weapon pointed upward. "Everyone stand down," Tom shouted into his radio, trying to regain control of the situation. The suspect's voice crackled through the line. "That wasn't me. I didn't fire at anyone." James's voice came next, calm but with an edge of urgency. "Derek, listen to me. You're losing control of the situation. If you don't want this to spiral, you need to lower your weapon and talk to me." Tom's eyes flicked to the store. Through the shattered glass, he could see the other suspects inside, their movements frantic. Derek, the leader, appeared to be shouting orders, but the tension was visibly fracturing the group. "Bennett," the sergeant called, jogging over. "That shot came from inside. Looks like one of them fired at the ceiling to keep the hostages in line." Tom felt a surge of anger. This wasn't a controlled operation anymore. It was a ticking time bomb. He gripped his radio. "James, tell them they've got one last chance. They either de-escalate now, or we're going in." There was a pause before James spoke. "Let me try something first." Inside the store, Derek was on edge. He paced back and forth, barking orders at his crew. One of them, a younger man named Joey, stood near the hostages, his hands shaking as he held his gun. "This is falling apart, Derek," Joey muttered. "We should have been out of here by now. Shut up and stick to the plan." Derek snapped. "We're not leaving without the money." The radio crackled, and James's voice broke through the tension. "Derek, it's time to face the truth. This plan isn't working. But that doesn't mean it's too late to change the outcome." Derek snatched the radio, his eyes wild. "You don't know anything about us. You think you can just talk us into surrendering?" "I know more than you think," James replied evenly. "I know you didn't start this with the intention of hurting anyone. I know you're doing this because you felt like you didn't have another choice." Derek's jaw tightened. "What choice do I have now? They'll lock me up forever." "Not necessarily," James said. "If you cooperate, if you let the hostages go, you'll show that you're not beyond redemption. It won't erase what's happened, but it'll make a difference." Derek's grip on the radio faltered. "And what about my crew? What happens to them?" "They'll have the same chance you do," James said. "But it starts with you. You're the leader. They're looking to you to make the right call." Outside, Tom listened intently, feeling a glimmer of hope. James was reaching Derek in a way no one else could. But the situation was still fragile, and one wrong move could tip the scales. "Bennett," the sergeant said quietly, "we've got snipers in position. If this goes south, we'll have to take them out." Tom nodded grimly. He hated the idea of anyone losing their life, even the suspects, but he understood the risks. He prayed it wouldn't come to that. James's voice came through the radio again. "Derek, I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to help you. But you have to trust me. Let the hostages go, and I'll make sure you're treated fairly." Inside the store, Derek lowered the radio, his mind racing. His crew watched him anxiously, their confidence in him waning. The hostages sat huddled together, their fear palpable. "Derek, we can't keep this up," Joey said, his voice cracking. "He's right. If we don't do something, we're all dead." Derek stared at the hostages, then at his crew. His hand trembled as he raised the radio again. "All right, Hunter. I'll let them go. But you'd better keep your word." Tom exhaled, relief washing over him. He motioned to the officers around him. "Stay sharp. This isn't over yet." One by one, the hostages were released, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and relief. Paramedics ushered them to safety while the officers maintained their positions. Inside the store, Derek and his crew huddled together, their nerves frayed. "What now?" Joey asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We wait," Derek said, his shoulders slumping. "Hunter said he'd help us." Outside, Tom grabbed his radio. "James, they've let the hostages go. What's the next move?" James's reply was measured. "Now we convince them to surrender. But they'll need reassurance that they won't be gunned down the moment they walk out." Tom frowned. "That's a big ask." "I know," James said. "But if you want this to end peacefully, it's the only way." Tom relayed the message to the SWAT commander, who reluctantly agreed to hold fire as long as the suspects remained unarmed. Back in the store, Derek looked at his crew, his resolve wavering. "All right," he said finally. "We'll go out, but we're not going out like cowards." "No guns." Joey nodded, and the others reluctantly followed suit, placing their weapons on the counter. Derek grabbed the radio. "We're coming out. No weapons, just us." Tom stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster. "Come out slowly, hands where we can see them." The door creaked open, and Derek stepped out first, his hands raised. Joey and the others followed, their expressions a mixture of fear and resignation. Officers moved in quickly, cuffing them and leading them to waiting squad cars. Tom exhaled deeply, the tension finally breaking. He grabbed his radio. "It's over, James. You did it." But James's reply was cryptic. "Not yet, officer. There's more to this than you realize." Tom frowned, his relief replaced by unease. "What are you talking about?" James paused. "I think Derek and his crew were just pawns. Someone else is pulling the strings." Tom's blood ran cold. The hostage crisis might have been resolved, but it was clear the story was far from over. Tom stood outside the jewelry store, the cool night air doing little to ease the tension still radiating through his body. The suspects had been taken into custody, the hostages were safe, and on the surface, the ordeal was over. But James's cryptic words echoed in his mind. Someone else is pulling the strings. He headed back to his cruiser, grabbing his radio. "James, if you've got more to say, now's the time." There was a pause before James's calm voice replied. "Derek and his crew are amateurs. Their execution was sloppy, but their tactics weren't. The way they disabled the security system, the precision of their timing, it doesn't add up." Tom frowned, his instincts kicking in. "You think someone coached them?" "I'd bet on it," James said. "There's a pattern here, officer. One you haven't seen yet." Tom glanced at the suspects being loaded into squad cars. Derek avoided his gaze, but something about the man's posture, a defeated slump mixed with nervous energy, told Tom that James might be onto something. Back at the station, Tom found James still sitting in his cell, looking unbothered by the chaos that had unfolded. Tom pulled up a chair, his curiosity overriding his frustration. "All right, Hunter," Tom said, leaning forward. "Let's hear it. What makes you so sure there's more to this?" James tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. When Derek spoke to me, he wasn't just scared. He was conflicted. That's not the mindset of someone fully invested in a plan like this. It's the mindset of someone who's being pressured. Pressured by who? Tom asked. James shrugged. That's the question, isn't it? But whoever it is, they've got resources. Enough to supply Derek and his crew with weapons, intel, and a plan. This wasn't random. Tom considered James's words. It wasn't uncommon for small-time criminals to be part of a larger operation, but something about this case felt off. You're saying there's someone higher up pulling the strings? Exactly, James said. And if you don't figure out who, this won't be the last robbery you deal with. Tom decided to test James's theory. He headed to the interrogation room, where Derek sat handcuffed to the table, his head bowed. Tom entered, closing the door behind him, and sat across from the suspect. Derek, Tom began, his tone firm. You've got two choices. You can take the fall for everything and let this end here. Or you can tell me who's behind all this and maybe catch a break. Derek looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wary. I already told your guys. I planned this. It was my idea. Tom leaned in, his gaze steady. You're lying. Someone gave you the tools, the timing, the confidence to pull this off. You're not that smart, Derek. So, who's calling the shots? Derek flinched but stayed silent. You think they care about you? Tom pressed. Whoever put you up to this, they're not going to bat an eye when you go down for it. But if you talk, I can help you. For a moment, Derek's resolve seemed to crack. His lips parted as if he was about to speak, but then he shook his head. I can't. You don't get it. They'll come after me. Tom's pulse quickened. Who will come after you? Derek clammed up, his eyes darting nervously around the room. It doesn't matter. You can't protect me from them. Frustrated, Tom returned to his desk and stared at the case files, piecing together what little he knew. The crew had been sloppy, but their preparation had been too meticulous for a group of amateurs. The tech used to disable the security system wasn't something you could buy at a local electronics store. Someone with connections and money had to be involved. As he mulled over the evidence, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. If you want answers, come back to the holding cell. I'll explain. Tom sighed. He didn't need to guess who it was. Heading to the holding area, he found James waiting for him, as calm as ever. You've got something to say? Tom asked, crossing his arms. James nodded. I think I can help you figure out who's behind this. Tom raised an eyebrow. And why would you do that? James smirked faintly. Because I've got nothing to lose, and you clearly need someone who can think like them. Tom hesitated. James's insight during the hostage situation had been invaluable, but trusting him further felt risky. What's your angle in all this? No angle, James said simply. I just don't like seeing people manipulate others for their own gain. And if I'm right about who's behind this, they won't stop until someone forces their hand. Tom decided to take the gamble. Over the next hour, James reviewed the evidence, pointing out patterns and connections Tom hadn't noticed. Look here, James said, tapping on a surveillance photo of Derek and his crew entering the jewelry store. See the van they arrived in? That model is often used by private security firms. Someone with access to corporate resources likely supplied it. Tom frowned. So we're looking for someone tied to a security company? Or someone with ties to the tech industry, James added. The equipment they use to disable the cameras isn't standard black market fare. It's proprietary. Whoever gave it to them knew exactly how it worked. Tom leaned back, the pieces starting to fall into place. You think this is corporate? James nodded. It wouldn't be the first time someone used hired hands to do their dirty work. And trust me, if they're willing to fund this kind of operation, they've got bigger plans than just knocking over a few jewelry stores. The next morning, Tom received a call from the tech lab. They'd found something unusual in the security footage, a brief but clear image of a man in a suit lingering near the jewelry store minutes before the robbery. He wasn't one of the suspects, but his presence felt suspicious. Tom sent the image to James, who studied it carefully. I know that man, James said quietly. His name is Victor Crane. He's a venture capitalist with a history of shady dealings. What kind of dealings? Tom asked. The kind that involve buying out failing companies and profiting off their collapse, James replied. If he's involved, this is bigger than a robbery. He's playing a long game. Tom's gut told him James was right. The robbery wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. And now, Tom knew they were up against someone with the resources and ruthlessness to turn the city upside down. Tom sat at his desk, staring at the photo of Victor Crane, his mind racing. If James was right, and so far, he had been, this wasn't just about a robbery. Crane was the kind of person who operated in the shadows, using money and influence to manipulate desperate people like Derek into doing his dirty work. Tom tapped his fingers against the desk, formulating his next move. He needed to confirm James's claims about Crane, but the billionaire was proving to be an enigmatic figure. Tom still couldn't shake the fact that James was sitting in a jail cell, willingly helping a police investigation, while a powerful businessman pulled strings to wreak havoc on the city. He leaned over and picked up his phone, dialing his sergeant. I need you to dig into a guy named Victor Crane. Anything you can find. Business ties, criminal history, whatever's available. You got it, the sergeant replied. What's the angle? I think he's the one funding Derek's operation, Tom said. This guy might be the key to stopping something bigger. While the sergeant ran the background check, Tom returned to the holding area where James waited. The calm, composed man watched Tom approach as if he'd been expecting him. Victor Crane, Tom said, crossing his arms. Tell me everything you know. James leaned back against the wall, his expression thoughtful. Crane is a parasite. He finds struggling companies, swoops in under the guise of saving them, and then bleeds them dry. He's ruthless, but careful. He's never been caught doing anything illegal, though plenty of people suspect him. How does that connect to the robbery? Tom asked. James smiled faintly. Crane has a habit of playing both sides. If he's involved, it's likely for leverage. Maybe he's setting the stage to buy out the jewelry chain, or the security firm tied to the operation. Whatever it is, he's profiting. Tom narrowed his eyes. You seem awfully sure of yourself. I've dealt with men like Crane my entire career, James said. And trust me, they don't do anything without a hidden agenda. Hours later, the sergeant called Tom back to his desk. I've got something on Crane, he said, handing Tom a thick folder. He's clean on paper, but he's connected to a private security firm called Iron Shield. They've been flagged in a couple of investigations for shady dealings, illegal surveillance, ties to organized crime. Nothing ever stuck, though. Tom flipped through the file, feeling the pieces of the puzzle start to click. Iron Shield supplied the van and the tech for the robbery. That's got to be our link. And there's more, the sergeant added. Crane recently acquired a stake in the firm. Just enough to have influence, but not enough to draw attention. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't a coincidence. Crane was pulling the strings, and Derek's crew had been pawns in a much larger game. That evening, Tom sat across from Derek in the interrogation room once more. The man looked exhausted, his bravado from earlier completely gone. I know about Victor Crane, Tom said, placing the file on the table. And I know he's the one who set you up. Derek's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Tom said firmly. He gave you the van, the tech, and the plan. He used you because he knew you were desperate. And now, he's going to leave you to take the fall. Derek shook his head, his voice trembling. I can't talk about him. You don't understand what he'll do. Tom leaned in, his tone serious but empathetic. I understand more than you think. But if you don't talk, you're going to prison for a very long time. Crane, on the other hand, will keep walking free. Derek hesitated, his hands trembling as they rested on the table. Finally, he sighed. All right, I'll tell you what I know. But you have to promise to protect me. Tom nodded. You have my word. Derek's story confirmed Tom's worst fears. Crane had approached him a few months earlier, offering him and his crew a way out of their financial struggles. The plan was simple. Pull off the robbery, make it look like a typical smash and grab, and Crane would take care of the rest. What was the point? Tom asked. Why would Crane orchestrate this? He said it was about leverage, Derek replied. The store chain is owned by a guy who's been refusing to sell to him. Crane figured if we hit a few locations, it would scare him into selling. Tom clenched his fists. It was exactly the kind of cold, calculated move James had described. Crane wasn't just a criminal. He was a puppeteer, pulling strings to get what he wanted without ever getting his hands dirty. Armed with Derek's confession, Tom knew he had enough to launch an investigation into Crane. But taking down someone as powerful as Victor Crane wouldn't be easy. The man had wealth, connections, and a track record of slipping through the cracks. Tom returned to James's cell, his determination renewed. "You were right," he said. "Crane's behind all of this. But getting to him is going to be a nightmare." James smiled faintly. "Then it's a good thing you've got me on your side." Tom raised an eyebrow. "And why exactly are you so eager to help?" James's expression turned serious. "Because Crane represents everything I walked away from. The greed, the manipulation, the disregard for human lives. I can't undo my past, but maybe I can help you stop him from hurting anyone else." Tom nodded slowly. "All right, Hunter. If you're in, then let's figure out how to take him down." As the two men began to formulate a plan, Tom couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. Crane was dangerous, and taking him on would be the most challenging case of Tom's career. But with James's insight and Derek's testimony, they finally had a fighting chance. And for the first time in years, Tom felt like he was fighting for something bigger than the badge. Tom's mind buzzed as he left the holding area. He had what he needed to launch an investigation into Victor Crane. But that didn't mean the battle was won. Crane was a man who operated with precision, resources, and a web of influence that extended into places Tom couldn't even imagine. To bring him down, Tom needed more than just Derek's shaky testimony. He needed hard evidence. The next morning, Tom convened with the station's task force to map out their approach. He stood in front of a whiteboard, outlining the connections between Derek, the robberies, Iron Shield security, and Crane. "This is where it all ties together," Tom said, pointing to a photo of Crane at the center of the web. "Derek's testimony puts him at the top of the operation, but we need to prove it. That means following the money, tracing the equipment, and finding anyone else he's used to do his dirty work." The team exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of determination and unease. They all knew that going after someone like Crane would bring intense scrutiny and possibly blowback. "What about Iron Shield?" one of the officers asked. "If Crane owns part of it, we can dig into their records, right?" Tom nodded. "That's the plan. But we'll need a warrant, and Crane's lawyers will fight us every step of the way." As the team began gathering preliminary evidence, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to bring James deeper into the fold. James's knowledge of corporate maneuvering and Crane's tactics could give them an edge. But involving him further was risky. James was still technically in custody, and trusting him too much could backfire. Tom headed back to the holding area, finding James sitting in his usual calm, meditative posture. "You've been quiet," Tom said, pulling up a chair. James opened his eyes and gave a small smile. "I figured you'd be back. You look like a man with more questions." "You're not wrong," Tom said, leaning forward. "If we're going to take Crane down, I need more from you. Not just theories, actionable intel. Are you willing to help?" James's expression turned serious. "I told you, Officer Bennett, I'm all in. But you need to understand something. Crane didn't get where he is by being careless. If you make a move against him, he'll see it coming. That's why we have to be smart," Tom said. "We've started tracing the van and the equipment Derek's crew used. If we can link it back to Crane or Iron Shield, we'll have leverage." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good start. But Crane won't just leave a paper trail sitting out in the open. He's meticulous. If you want to find what you're looking for, you'll need someone on the inside." Tom frowned. "And I'm guessing you're volunteering?" James chuckled softly. "I might not have my billions anymore, but I know how to navigate his world. I can get close enough to find what you need." Tom wrestled with the decision for the rest of the day. Letting James get involved on such a deep level was a huge risk, but time wasn't on their side. Crane was likely already aware that Derek's crew had been caught, and if he suspected an investigation, he'd start covering his tracks. By evening, Tom had made up his mind. He returned to James's cell with a proposition. "We're letting you out. Tom said bluntly. James raised an eyebrow. Letting me out? Or putting me to work? Both, Tom admitted. If you're serious about helping us take down Crane, you'll need to prove it. That means putting yourself in the middle of this mess. James stood, his calm confidence unwavering. Fair enough. What's the plan? The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Tom worked with the task force to set up James with a cover story that would allow him to infiltrate Crane's world. Using contacts from James's past, they created the illusion that James had recently come into a small but significant investment, enough to pique Crane's interest. You're playing the role of a low-level investor looking for a seat at the table, Tom explained during one of their briefings. Crane loves opportunities to manipulate people he sees as ambitious but inexperienced. James smirked. In other words, I'm playing the fool. Exactly, Tom said, but we'll be watching. You'll wear a wire, and if anything goes wrong, we'll pull you out. James nodded, his expression serious. Don't worry, officer. I've handled worse. The first meeting with Crane's people was set at an upscale cocktail lounge known for its exclusivity. James, dressed in a borrowed suit that barely fit his lanky frame, entered the lounge with an air of nervous excitement, a carefully rehearsed act. Tom sat in a van parked a block away, listening to the feed from James's wire. The task force had stationed officers discreetly throughout the area, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. Mr. Hunter, I presume, a smooth voice said as James approached a private booth. The speaker was a sharply dressed man with a calculating gaze, one of Crane's lieutenants. That's right, James said, extending a hand. Thanks for meeting with me. The man shook his hand but didn't smile. Mr. Crane doesn't meet with just anyone. You'll have to convince me you're worth his time. James settled into the booth, his calm demeanor hiding the tension he felt. I'm not just anyone. I've got resources and connections, and I'm looking for someone who knows how to use them. Tom listened intently, every muscle in his body tense as James navigated the conversation. The lieutenant asked probing questions, testing James's story at every turn. But James deflected with ease, his answers measured and convincing. By the end of the meeting, the lieutenant seemed satisfied. I'll pass your information along to Mr. Crane. If he's interested, you'll hear from us. James nodded, maintaining his composed facade. Looking forward to it. As James exited the lounge and returned to the surveillance van, Tom couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and apprehension. They had successfully planted James in Crane's orbit, but the real danger was just beginning. What did I tell you? James said, climbing into the van with a sly grin. Easy as pie. Tom shook his head, his expression stern. Don't get cocky. This is just the first step. Crane's not going to trust you overnight. James's grin faded, replaced by a look of determination. I know, but if we play this right, we'll get what we need. As the van pulled away, Tom glanced at James, realizing that the billionaire-turned-homeless man was quickly becoming the most unpredictable and valuable asset in the fight against Victor Crane. The following days were a waiting game, each passing hour tightening the tension in Tom's chest. James's performance at the cocktail lounge had been flawless, but Crane wasn't the type to rush into a deal. He would investigate James, test him, and look for weaknesses to exploit. Tom's gut told him they were walking a razor-thin line. Meanwhile, Tom's team worked to build their case against Crane. The forensic techs had managed to link the van used in the robbery to Iron Shield security, confirming Crane's involvement. But it wasn't enough. They needed direct evidence that Crane orchestrated the robbery, and that was where James came in. One evening, as Tom sat at his desk reviewing the case files, his phone buzzed. It was James. They bit, James said without preamble. I just got a call from one of Crane's lieutenants. He wants to meet tomorrow. Tom straightened in his chair. Where? A private residence in Lake Forest. Apparently, it's one of Crane's safe houses, James replied. The lieutenant didn't give much away, but I get the sense this is a test. Tom frowned. If it's a safe house, they'll have security. We need to get you wired up. Already expected that, James said, but I'll need a backup plan in case things go south. Crane's people aren't exactly forgiving. Tom nodded, already jotting down notes. We'll have a team nearby. You won't be alone. James hesitated. Let's hope I won't need them. The next day, James stood outside the imposing gates of a sprawling estate. He adjusted the small earpiece Tom's team had given him, his heart pounding in his chest. It had been years since he'd worn a suit like this, since he'd played the role of a corporate climber. The irony of doing it now, as a disgraced billionaire infiltrating another billionaire's empire, wasn't lost on him. The gates opened, and a sleek black car pulled up to escort him inside. James climbed in, careful to maintain his calm demeanor as the driver. A stoic man in dark glasses said nothing. Tom and his team listened in from a surveillance van parked half a mile away. The estate's sprawling grounds made it impossible to get closer without drawing attention. "Remember," Tom's voice crackled in James's earpiece, "stick to the story. You're a desperate investor looking for a mentor. Don't give them any reason to doubt you." "Got it," James muttered, keeping his voice low. The car pulled up to the mansion's entrance, where Crane's lieutenant waited. He greeted James with a polite but distant nod and led him inside. The interior was as lavish as James expected. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that likely cost more than most people's homes. The lieutenant led James into a study, where Victor Crane himself sat behind a massive oak desk. He was a tall man with silver hair, sharp eyes, and a presence that commanded attention. He gestured for James to sit without saying a word. "Mr. Hunter," Crane said finally, his voice smooth and measured. "I've heard a lot about you." James smiled faintly. "I hope it's all good." Crane chuckled. "That depends. My associates tell me you're looking for opportunities. Care to elaborate?" James leaned forward slightly, his tone confident but not overbearing. "I've spent my career building things. Businesses, networks, relationships. But lately, I've realized the real power lies in being able to disrupt the system when necessary. That's why I came to you." Crane studied him carefully, his sharp gaze searching for cracks in James's facade. "Disruption is a dangerous game. Mr. Hunter, are you prepared for the risks?" James nodded. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Crane's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. Let's see if you're as bold as you claim." Back in the van, Tom and his team listened intently, their nerves stretched taut. Crane's tone was calm, but there was an undercurrent of menace that made it clear he wasn't someone to be taken lightly. "Keep him talking," Tom muttered, as if James could hear him. "We need more." Inside the study, Crane leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Hunter. A test, if you will." James raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Crane slid a folder across the desk. "There's a property downtown, a small tech startup that's been resisting my offers. They're nothing special, but their location is valuable. I need someone to persuade them to sell." James opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. It was a thinly veiled threat, a list of the company's vulnerabilities, from financial struggles to personal information about the owners. "What kind of persuasion are we talking about?" James asked, keeping his tone neutral. "Nothing too messy," Crane said with a smirk. "Just enough pressure to make them see reason." James nodded slowly, closing the folder. "Consider it done." As James left the estate, his mind raced. He had agreed to Crane's test, but now he had to figure out how to complete the assignment without actually harming anyone. More importantly, he needed to use the opportunity to gather evidence that would tie Crane directly to the operation. Back in the van, Tom's voice crackled in James's ear. "That was risky, but you did good. Now we just have to figure out how to turn this to our advantage." James climbed into the van, his face grim. "We'll need to move fast. Crane's watching me, and if I slip up, this whole thing falls apart." Tom nodded. "Then let's make sure we don't slip." The next morning, James met with the tech startup's owners under the pretense of being an independent investor. He carefully warned them about Crane's tactics, urging them to stay vigilant while secretly planting a tracking device on their building's surveillance system. Meanwhile, Tom's team worked to trace the money trail behind Crane's operations, uncovering a series of offshore accounts linked to Iron Shield. It was a breakthrough, but it wasn't enough. They needed a smoking gun, something that would prove Crane's direct involvement. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Crane's lieutenant called James regularly, checking on his progress and subtly hinting that failure wasn't an option. Each call was recorded, adding to the growing pile of evidence against Crane. Finally, one of the techs working with Tom's team made a discovery: a series of encrypted emails on Iron Shield servers that reference Crane's plans to expand his control over the city's tech sector. It was the missing piece they needed, but decrypting the emails would take time. Late one night, as James sat in his small apartment reviewing his notes, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're being watched. Be careful." James's heart skipped a beat. He glanced around the room, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow and sound. Across town, Tom received a similar message. It was clear that Crane's people were onto them, and the stakes had just risen. The walls were closing in, and the clock was ticking. Tom and James had no choice but to go all in. Crane wasn't just playing a dangerous game. He was raising the stakes, and the next move could determine everything. Tom sat in the station's dimly lit briefing room, the weight of the text message pressing heavily on him. If Crane's people were aware of the investigation, it meant their entire operation was at risk. Worse, James was in the lion's den with no way to know how close Crane might be to uncovering their plan. He dialed James immediately. The call rang twice before James picked up. "Tell me you're somewhere safe," Tom said without preamble. James's voice was calm, but there was a tension beneath it. "Safe for now, but I got a message too. Whoever sent it knows what we're doing." Tom exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "We've got to assume Crane's people are monitoring everything. You can't go back to that safe house." "I wasn't planning to," James said, "but I think we can use this to our advantage." Tom frowned. "How?" "Crane's not paranoid without reason. If he thinks I'm a threat, he'll make a move. And when he does, we'll be ready." "You're suggesting we bait him," Tom said flatly. "That's reckless, even for you." James let out a dry laugh. "Reckless is all I've got left, Officer Bennett. But it's the best shot we have." Tom was silent for a moment, weighing the risks. Finally, he said, "All right, but we're doing this my way. We'll set the trap, but you're not walking in alone." The plan came together over the next 48 hours. Tom's team planted false leads and subtle breadcrumbs in the hopes of drawing Crane into making a move against James. Meanwhile, they worked around the clock to decrypt the emails found on Iron Shield servers, hoping to secure concrete evidence of Crane's criminal operations. James maintained his cover, continuing to play the ambitious investor eager to earn Crane's trust. He arranged another meeting with Crane's lieutenant, this time at a private club in the heart of the city. Tom's team was positioned nearby, listening to the conversation through James's hidden wire. Every word could be the piece that cracked the case wide open. At the club, James sat across from the lieutenant, his posture relaxed despite the storm brewing inside him. "Crane's impressed with you," the lieutenant said, sipping a glass of whiskey. "Not many people make it this far." "I'm glad to hear it," James replied, keeping his tone light. "I'm ready for the next step." The lieutenant leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Before we go any further, there's something you need to know. Crane doesn't tolerate betrayal. If you're playing both sides, it won't end well for you." James met the man's gaze without flinching. "I'm not stupid. I know what's at stake." "Good," the lieutenant said, leaning back, "because there's a lot riding on this next deal. If it goes south, it'll be on your head." Back in the surveillance van, Tom listened intently. The lieutenant's words confirmed what they already suspected. Crane was planning something big, but the specifics remained frustratingly out of reach. Then, one of the tech officers monitoring the Iron Shield servers let out an excited shout. "We've got it. The emails are decrypted." Tom rushed over to the computer, scanning the documents as they popped up on the screen. The emails detailed Crane's involvement in the robberies, his plans to intimidate the tech startup owners, and his broader strategy to seize control of key assets in the city. "This is it," Tom said, his voice firm. "This is the evidence we need to bring him down." But Crane wasn't going down quietly. That night, as James returned to his apartment, he noticed a black SUV idling at the corner of his street. His instincts kicked in, and he ducked into a nearby alley, pulling out his phone to call Tom. "I think I've been made," James said, his voice low. Tom's heart sank. "Get out of there. Now." James started moving, his eyes scanning for an escape route. But as he turned the corner, another SUV pulled up, cutting him off. Two men stepped out, their faces obscured by hats and sunglasses. "Mr. Hunter," one of them said, his voice cold. "Mr. Crane would like a word." James raised his hands, keeping his movements slow. "I don't suppose he sent a car for me." The men didn't laugh. One of them reached for James's arm, but James stepped back, his mind racing. "All right," he said. "Let's not make this messy. Lead the way." As they escorted James to the SUV, he discreetly tapped the emergency button on his hidden earpiece. Back in the van, Tom's team received the signal. "We've got him," Tom said, his voice steady but urgent. "Track his location and move in." The SUVs drove to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. James was led inside, where Crane waited in the center of the cavernous space, flanked by armed guards. "Mr. Hunter," Crane said with a cold smile, "I've been hearing interesting things about you." James forced a smirk. "All good things, I hope?" Crane's smile faded. "Not quite. It seems you've been poking around in places you shouldn't." "I don't like that." James's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression calm. "I've been doing what you asked, proving my worth. If that's a crime, then I guess I'm guilty." Crane studied him for a long moment before nodding to one of his guards. The man stepped forward, grabbing James by the collar and throwing him into a nearby chair. "Let's see how much you're really worth," Crane said, his tone icy. Outside the warehouse, Tom's team prepared to move in. The surveillance van was filled with tense energy as they monitored the feed from James's wire. "On my signal," Tom said, his voice steady. "We're getting him out of there." The clock was ticking, and Tom knew one wrong move could cost James's life. But as he looked at the warehouse, his determination hardened. This was it, the moment they had been building toward. Victor Crane was about to face justice, or everything was about to fall apart. Tom's team moved into position around the warehouse, their weapons drawn and their breaths measured. The tension was palpable, every second stretching out as they prepared to breach. Inside, James sat bound to the chair, his mind racing as he calculated his next move. Victor Crane stood before him, his cold smile revealing nothing but malice. "Do you know what separates men like me from everyone else?" Crane asked, pacing slowly. "It's vision. The ability to see the whole board and move the pieces accordingly." James forced a smirk, masking his fear. "You mean the ability to throw pawns away when it suits you?" Crane's eyes narrowed, and he nodded to one of his guards. The man stepped forward and delivered a sharp punch to James's stomach. James gasped, doubling over in pain but refusing to let Crane see him break. "I don't tolerate insolence," Crane said flatly, "but I will give you one last chance. Tell me who you're working with, and maybe I'll let you walk out of here." James coughed, his voice strained but defiant. "I'm working with the truth, and something tells me that's not your favorite partner." Crane's composure faltered for a split second before he signaled to his guards. "I'm done with this." As the guards approached, James clenched his fists, bracing for the worst. But before they could lay a hand on him, a deafening crash echoed through the warehouse as the doors were blown open. "Police, drop your weapons." Tom's voice boomed as he and his team stormed in, their weapons trained on Crane and his guards. The room erupted into chaos. Crane's men scrambled to defend themselves, but they were no match for the tactical precision of Tom's team. James watched as officers swiftly disarmed and subdued the guards, their movements efficient and controlled. Crane, however, remained eerily calm. As Tom approached him, gun raised, Crane smirked. "Do you really think this changes anything, Officer Bennett?" "It changes everything," Tom said firmly. "You're done, Crane." Crane chuckled softly, even as the officers cuffed him. "You think arresting me will stop this? There's always someone else ready to take my place." Tom leaned in, his voice cold. "Maybe, but it won't be you." As the dust settled and the suspects were escorted out, Tom approached James, who was being freed from the chair by one of the officers. "You all right?" Tom asked. James nodded, wincing as he stood. "I've had better days." Tom managed a faint smile. "You did good in there." "Couldn't have done it without you." James shook his head. "Couldn't have done it without you pulling me out in time." Back at the station, Crane's arrest made headlines. The decrypted emails, combined with Derek's testimony and the evidence gathered at the warehouse, painted a damning picture of Crane's criminal enterprise. For once, the justice system had the upper hand on a man who had spent his life evading consequences. Tom sat at his desk, reviewing the mountain of paperwork the case had generated. James entered, now dressed in fresh clothes and looking more like the man Tom had seen in those old photos of Hunter Innovations. "So, what happens now?" James asked. "For Crane," Tom said, "he'll fight it, but with what we've got, he's not getting out of this." "And for me?" James pressed. Tom looked at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You've more than paid your dues. I'll make sure the charges against you are dropped. As far as I'm concerned, you're free to go." James nodded, a mixture of relief and uncertainty crossing his face. Freedom. Funny how it doesn't feel the way I thought it would. Tom stood, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "You've got a second chance, James. What you do with it is up to you." A week later, James stood at the edge of a park overlooking the city. He watched as people bustled through their lives, a quiet smile on his face. He had no plans to reclaim his old empire, but he knew there was still work to be done, work that mattered. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Tom. "If you ever get bored of being a good guy, I could use another detective." "Just saying." James chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe the world hadn't completely written him off after all. With renewed purpose, he walked away, ready to start the next chapter of his life. Not as the man he once was, but as the man he was meant to be.